Well, the balance of trade represents the difference between what a country exports and what a country imports. Now, these are two different functions that are really important for a nation's economy. So much like businesses buy and sell products, so sell goods and services, but they have to purchase things, the balance of trade works in a similar way for a country. So an export represents something that a country produces but sells overseas. So we produce it and then we sell to another country. Now, this is important because this works a lot like an income. So in this case, let's say we're looking at the U.S. here. In the United States, a U.S. business creates a good or offers a service or whatever the case is, and that gets exported, so it gets transported overseas. And then, of course, the money flows back into the U.S. So it kind of the flow of money is going back in the United States. Now, the difference, of course, we have obviously imports as well. Now, imports are things that we purchase. They are produced internationally. And we actually bring them into the U.S. for consumption. Now, in the U.S., we import quite a bit, but we also do export as well. Now, on the surface, this doesn't really seem like that big of a deal, right? So we create things and we ship them overseas, but then we also buy other things, and does it really make a whole lot of a difference? Well, I know you're looking over here, so we might as well turn our direction to the table on the left side of your screen. So at the top here, we have a couple of different columns: exports, imports, what we call a surplus or deficit that I'll get into, and then, of course, the year. Now, one important distinction I want to make is whenever we have a situation to which a company's exports, so what it produces domestically and sells to another country, exceeds the imports, we actually have what we call a trade surplus. And this is a very good thing. It's a very positive thing. Now, the flip side of that, of course, is when we have a situation to which our exports are less than our imports, we actually have a trade deficit. That means that the flow of goods and money is flowing to other countries and not to our own. And of course, we know that trade deficits is a term that you've heard in popular media. It's vocalized relatively frequently. Is something that's a negative thing. And in the U.S., we have this trade deficit that continues to mount and mount and mount. So why is it a big deal? Well, look back at this graph here, or this table rather. You can see here on the left column, so the leftmost column, under exports, these figures here, which are represented, you're probably thinking, well, $535, that's not a big deal. All these figures are in billions, just for context. So $535 billion in the year 1990 was exported to other countries. Likewise, importing, so brought in, was $616 billion. So in 1990, we had a trade deficit. Notice there's a trend. They're all negative, so those represent all deficits of $81 billion. Now, that's not enormous, but look what happens over the years. So 2000, it grows to $372 billion. In 2010, it grows to $495 billion, and then it gets to $548 billion in 2011. Then it drops temporarily a little bit to $479 billion. We have kind of a good year in 2013, but then it comes back up to $531 billion in 2015, and then $567 billion in 2017. Now, one thing I should have mentioned is where I got the data. So the data all came from the U.S. Bureau of Census, specifically from the Foreign Trade Division, which kind of tracks imports and exports and those sorts of things. And so if you want to corroborate the data, you can go there and you, of course, take a look. So this is not a good thing. Now, one thing I want to mention here first is that in the year 2000, you see this drastic increase. Well, if you recall, in 1995, China was allowed to enter the WTO, the World Trade Organization. And so as a result, there began to be a lot of kind of increase in interest in China, flow of resources and different things into China, and China became sort of a manufacturing powerhouse. And you start to see that reflected in the data. right? In the year 2000, you have this increase to $372 billion. That is a deficit. Our imports increased to, over $1 trillion from 616 billion just 10 years before. It sounds like a long time, but it really is not that long amount of time in the history of nations and those sorts of things. So why is this that big of a deal, right? And you've seen this. This was a very big and prominent thing that President Trump ran on, that the trade balance is not fair, that China, of course, is taking advantage of the U.S. and has the ability or really is benefiting from kind of this favorable trade relationship, and they don't buy enough of our goods. And so what's the big deal? Well, the truth of the matter is the balance of trade has a lot of important implications to a country. So let's just look generally at the situation. When you have a country that is reliant a lot on imports. Much like the U.S., we purchase a lot of things overseas and we bring them and consume them in the U.S. That's not very good because essentially we're supporting other businesses, specifically non-U.S. businesses. Now, we can get into all of the merits regarding, should we be supporting those businesses? Should we support U.S. businesses? I mean, that's beside the point. But the reality is by importing when our imports exceed our exports, we're essentially sending U.S. dollars overseas. Whereas if we, have more exports, that's money that's going the other way. And so, if you have the U.S. here and then we have some kind of foreign country, if we are, producing a product and we're sending that product over to the foreign country, in return, right, that money for the product is actually coming into the U.S., which is really beneficial because then there are a lot of things that help. Now we're supporting U.S. businesses. You have demand for different products and services that supports, obviously, employment, which in turn supports wages, which in turn supports productivity, which in turn increases consumer spending. So if we certainly had the option to, we would want to be predominantly an exporting country and not import as much, which is why politically you've seen a lot of kind of animosity regarding trade, and you've seen the U.S. renegotiate trade deals specifically with Mexico and Canada, so they're a little more favorable. And we see obviously a huge trade war with China. A lot of it is stemmed at trying to get this balance of trade more in line. The U.S. does not want this huge surplus or huge deficit rather to continue to take place for subsequent years, because that's money that's supporting international businesses when we think that, it could be supporting the U.S. businesses as well. Now, eventually, what happens is when you have a trade deficit, this also supports what we call this concept of the balance of payments. Now, balance of payments is very similar to the balance of trade, right? Trade, we're just referring to kind of the goods flowing over international borders, right, from one country to another. The balance of payments is in many ways affected by the balance of trade because the balance of payment is all about the flow of money. And the flow of money typically is going to follow the flow of goods, right? So if we are selling, let's say, automobiles to China, for example, well, then the flow of money is going to go into the U.S., which is beneficial. If we're purchasing a lot of products from China, say smartphones, for example, and other electronics, then the flow of the U.S. dollar is going to flow into China and support those businesses and those sorts of things. So this is also affected, of course, by tourism. So if you have internationals that travel to a country for vacation, or whether it's educational, maybe they're going to school, right? So you have a flow, the balance of payments that way. But one of the biggest contributor to the balance of payments is, of course, the result of this equation here, which is the exports minus the imports. And that'll, of course, affect the flow of money, which is why this balance of trade topic is very topical and is why we see it in the headlines today, because it does have a really big impact ultimately on that flow of money that is so important. And we start looking at even the decline of U.S. manufacturing. And by and large, that's a big part of kind of that balance of trade and the shifting from shifting over to imports. And then obviously the flow of money goes that way, which in turn means is we can't support those industries the same way.